Okay. So we're just about coming up on the hour. So I hope everyone is doing well. I have an opening prayer today that is as much a reflection actually from St. Basil that I thought would speak to the larger context of the readings from today. I've also extended both readings, so they'll be longer than normal. I'm going to read two paragraphs, both before and after our meditation. And the reason for that is as I'm reviewing the material, I know we've been talking some time about the association of the ego with what I've called in the book borrowed clothing, and didn't want to belabor the point over too many weeks. So I wanted to in a sense, condense some of the readings because I think otherwise it'll become, I spend several pages developing the point and don't want it to extend longer than it needs to, I think, to make that point. So you'll pardon me if the readings are a little longer today, but that'll sort of just help us keep the conversation moving. So what I've tried to do is to look at both the practice for today, but also the prayers in association with what I'm trying to say in this section as a way of trying to embody that. So let me call up our share screen. Okay. So I suspect some of you have received the email from Joanne. So Joanne, thank you for your kind reminder that today is our essentially 1-year anniversary. We began what would have essentially been this weekend last year, September 7th. So this is as close as we're going to get to a 1-year anniversary. So thank you for walking with me all of this time and for just accompanying me through the reading of this book at this time. So it's a nice time to celebrate, and it's hard for me to believe how much has changed in that 1 year. We're in such different places than we were. So it's good all the better to be on this journey together. So I begin, as always, Venum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you and welcome you back this morning. And our opening prayer consists of a reflection from Basil the Great and then a prayer in response. I've carried this little saying from Basil in my Bible for probably 25 years now, so it's with me all the time. He writes this: when someone steals another's clothes, we call them a thief. Should we not give the same name to one who could clothe the naked and does not? The bread in your cupboard belongs to the hungry. The coat hanging unused in your closet belongs to one who needs it. The shoes rotting in your closet belong to the one who has no shoes. And the money which you hoard up belongs to the poor. So we pray, O Lord, give us the grace to see in each of our possessions, in all of our attachments, great teachers of the interior life, repeating the lesson again and again. Let go, let go, let go. Amen. So our first reading today begins on and ends on page 45. It begins a new subsection of this chapter, which I've entitled Borrowed Clothing. And it goes like this. So given, this is coming on the heels of the discussion around the Genesis narrative in which Adam and Eve are sort of exiled, as it were, from the garden. So given the enormity of this moment in the narrative, it is easy to overlook the subtle gesture by God who made garments of skin for the man and for his wife and clothed them. This is borrowed clothing, coverings that will conceal their nakedness even as they reveal something about each of them in this new world they are about to enter. Metaphorically speaking, we might say the clothing represents the ego, and we do well to differentiate it from the false self. The ego is not an aspect of our deepest identity, but a part of our psychological construct, worn throughout the course of a lifetime. It will be shed upon death as we ultimately return to our nakedness before God. In many spiritual circles, the ego is conflated with the false self, an easy mistake to make because the ego often operates under its influence. But there is an important distinction. The false self is nothing more than a constructed identity we project to fill the void left in the wake of our self-alienation from God. It is nothing more than the generation of thoughts, feelings, and mental chatter with no real substance behind it. In order to compensate for unmet needs, emotional wounds, and psychological scarring, we generate an internal narrative convincing ourselves of our own virtue and demonizing those who threaten the wounded or neglected aspects of ourselves. We project our sense of self into the world, thriving on competition, exerting our control, and manipulating relationships to avoid further pain and assist in our own dominance. To such a person living out of the false self, death is terrifying because it marks the end of my world and therefore the end of the world. So our second reading this morning spans 45 to 46 for those of you who have the book. So I'm contrasting here the ego from what I've called the false self. So the ego, by contrast, is something given, as Genesis 3:21 would suggest. Like garments of skin, it is a gift of borrowed clothing. Part of our human psychology we can develop in a healthy way over the course of a lifetime. As long as we do not mistake the ego for the fullness of our identity, it can express something of our true identity in the world, even as it conceals our primal nakedness. Like the daily clothing we wear, the ego can be put on or removed as needed. If our ego is taken up to express something of our true selves, it can be a tool for much good in the world. To claim I'm a professor, a fireman, a nurse, a physicist is to assume an identity in the world based on socially accepted credentials and experiences. These acquired identities we develop over the course of a lifetime do not constitute one's deepest self any more than a suit and tie, a nurse's uniform, or a pair of jeans. But they can serve as a means of allowing one's deepest identity to be expressed in the world. Very often we fail to distinguish between our true selves and the garments we wear, leaving our egos vulnerable to the whims, desires, and emotional programming generated by the false self. But through gradual detachment from the false self, we learn to take up our egoic identity when necessary and set it down again when it is no longer needed. To extend the metaphor, the ego is like a tool, say a hammer. It can be used to build up or tear down. When used to advance goodness and the well-being of others, these egoic identities can rightly be said to reflect something of one's true self. When one's ego is under the influence of the false self, we encounter the worst forms of idolatry, which historically have occasioned all manner of evil and oppression. So for those of you who are not able to stay for our shared conversation, our closing prayer. Abba, Father, I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will. I await your silent bidding so that only your will be done in me. Whatever you do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. In your tender love, I offer the gift of my whole being, given to you alone from the depths of love in my heart. Amen. So you have the floor. I also just, I don't see all of you on screen at the same time. So if you do, if you would like to raise your hand. Oh, there we go. Okay, so Brother Columba, I see your hand is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I was really touched in the first paragraph by the sentence, to such a person living out the false self, that is terrifying. It is difficult for me to read that because I lost my mother when I was only 22, and the rules in the Netherlands are so bad that they can't help you if you are the only child. It happened to me. The hiring company put me on the street. So I had no home. And they didn't have the opportunity to help me, and they only give me a paper where I need to describe my name for a homeless house. So for me, on that moment, the death of my mother was very terrifying, and to read now that it is in combination with living out the false self, it's very difficult for me to understand. So I hope you can explain a little bit more about it, that I understand it, but it is very confronting for me now to read this.
Mm. Did you say confronting or comforting?
It confrontates me very much.
Mm-hmm. And that's because of your experience of your mother's passing so young and the effect that had on you because of the social system.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can understand that. I think as we flesh this whole conversation out over the next several weeks, because this section continues, you'll see the idea of attachment is what's really at stake here, and an attempt to distinguish between what some have raised even on this forum in the past several weeks as the gift of the psychological development of ego as a good thing, and the distinguishing of that from the false self, which is not even a bad thing. It's just a no thing. It's not there. It's that projection that often gets woven into our sense of ego and therefore becomes problematic. So as we look at that and as that unfolds, Brother Columba, I'll be curious to see how your own personal experience, not of your own death, which is what the text is really referencing, but of your mother's passing, and the effects that would have on you subsequently. So just keep that in mind as we look through what we're going to be talking about. I see a lot of hands are up, and see if you can the distinction between what it means to be so attached to one's own sense of self that death really means the death of everything, the death of the world, because what can continue after, right? As opposed to a sense of detachment where death becomes that place of transition.
Thank
And
you.
you're very welcome. Roger, if I could ask you to share, to co-host.
I'm sorry.
Then, yeah, if you could give me the ability to co-host, I can help with the raised hands as we move along. In the meantime, Mary, did you, I think your hand was next.
Good morning. Thank you for this. Could you give an example of when ego is under the influence of the false self? Could you give a specific example what that would mean?
Oh, sure. So first, to situate or understand ego as a neutral thing, right? Not as a bad thing, but as something that is in itself a tool, or like clothing that we put on and take off. It could, like a uniform that I talk about, for example. So let's use a military uniform. A military uniform signals someone who is in service of their country, right? Dedicated to the protection of the national interests of that country and so on. And a military could be used for, say, defense of that country against an aggressor, or so forth and so on. On the other hand, when that same military, think about the military garb, right, the military uniforms, could become an oppressive force within that particular country or another country. And so if you think of the military as a socially constructed reality, right? If I'm a soldier, I will not be a soldier in death. That's a part of a constructed identity of somebody I am in the world. And the uniform that represents that constructed or egoic identity is my military uniform. And that can either be used as a liberating force in the world, a peacekeeping force, or it could be used as an oppressive force, right? Either within one's own country or beyond. So there would be an example of a constructed egoic identity, not part of an individual's ultimate identity in the world or in the next world, as it were, that can be put on or taken off either for oppressive or liberating ends.
So the oppressive piece means being dominated by the false self?
That's correct. So in other words, one of the goals I'm trying to establish is kind of an anatomy of the soul here. I think too often the word ego and false self in Christian contemplative literature is conflated. And I think that's a problem, because I think what that does is demonizes the human ego, right? And so, for example, we have to be careful about what we mean by the ego. We're not talking about egotistical, which is when the ego, let's say this, an egotistical person would be somebody who is whose ego is dominated by the false self. It all becomes about me. But when I can understand the ego as a tool, right? I've gone to many, many years of higher education. I've dedicated my life to studying theology. And at the end of the day, they call me a doctor. That's not a true ultimate part of my identity, but helps me function in the world as someone who can educate, lift up, enlighten, right? Share knowledge, help people's views expand, and so on. I can also use that same authority in an oppressive way. I can be demeaning to my students. I could put them down, right? If I'm a jerk, right? So the question is, if hubris leads me to a kind of sense of arrogance around, I'm better than you all, I'm elitist because I have all this knowledge and you don't, then that very constructed identity, I become so overly identified with it and use it in a way that becomes destructive rather than life-giving or constructive. There you see the difference. But the point is, we shouldn't demonize the ego as such, which is, I think, what happens too often in contemplative or spiritual language. We think of the ego as a bad thing. And what I want us to think of the ego as a fleeting thing, as clothing that we wear for a lifetime, but not as something that's necessarily part of your essence. So Jesus has a confrontation with Sadducees in the gospel, where they say, well, you know, a woman who's married to a man, 7 different men, they were all brothers, none of them ever had children. When they all, and then they die. When she dies, whose wife will they be, right? Whose husband will be the real one, since she was married to all 7? And Jesus says, well, you don't get it. Those relationships are not something that carry into the kingdom, as it were. There won't be people married to one another. There won't be parents and children. There will just be this sense of love, right? This deeper connection that we will ultimately call the body of Christ. So all of these social constructs can be like the president of the United States. That authority vested in that office and that identity can be used in a constructive or destructive way, depending on whether the office of the presidency is held by someone who is more understanding of themselves, the true self, using that authority to build up a country, to build world relations, to keep peace around the world, and so on, as opposed to for their own egotistical ends.
That was so helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mary. Yeah, no problem. And we'll continue to explore this idea over the next several weeks. So this isn't the last time we'll sort of have a chance to flesh this out. And I think that brings us to Kathy.
Good morning. As I was reading the paragraphs this morning and preparing for this session, in the second paragraph on the false self, which I know I'm grappling with big time, the one phrase that really had a lot of energy to it is that about the false, when we're possessed by the false self, that we demonize those who threaten the wounded or neglected aspects of ourselves. And I feel like I've got this huge concrete rebar steel wall keeping me from being able to even see what that is. So could you give some examples of what that is?
Sure. Just so that I could read it for context again, was that in the first reading or the second, Kathy?
The first one, the second paragraph of the first reading, about halfway down the sentence.
Okay,
I mean, halfway down the paragraph.
Right. Okay, so if I think I've got it correctly, in order to compensate for unmet needs, emotional wounds, and psychological scarring, we generate an internal narrative, convincing ourselves of our own virtue and demonizing those who threaten the wounded or neglected aspects of ourselves. It's that one?
Yes.
It's been suggested in contexts where we study Christian ethics or moral theology that even the most evil acts perpetrated throughout human history have been done under the false belief or assumption that that act was good by the person who does the action. That, in other words, a person is capable of doing tremendous harm, but in their own conception of the doing sees a good in what they're doing, doesn't see what they're doing necessarily as an evil thing, but justifies it because they believe in some good that they're achieving in that, by that means. And that question is hotly debated in Christian ethics. Does a person ever actually do an evil thing believing it's evil, or do they somehow, is the evil in the fact that they're able to so twist what is good and bad to convince themselves that their actions are ultimately in service of some good, that they cannot ultimately reconcile that what they've done is in fact evil, if that makes sense. And we can just throw out the name Hitler as an egregious example of that, who, right, in his so-called final solution, in his own twisted view of the world, actually believed he was purifying, right, his country for the Aryan race over against those who were parasites and so forth, and who were going to destroy that. So we can see from our perspective how evil that is. The question is, in Hitler's mind, was he doing something evil, or in his mind did he twist that into a good? That's the problem. So if we cannot come to terms with our own interior capacity, right, for good and for evil, right, often grounded in woundedness, reactivity, defensiveness, right? We have the tendency, and this is almost now today a popular psychological truism, we have a tendency to project that onto someone else. We see the evil outside of ourselves, even where it's not, because we cannot come to terms with the brokenness or woundedness and unmet needs within ourselves. So we project that. We end up with a scapegoat. And we justify what we do to that scapegoat because of our inability to come to terms with how that somehow exterior person or group or reality represents some threat, perceived threat, which is really confronting an unmet need within myself, something, whatever that is, depending on the context. One of the reasons I think that the contemplative life is demanding is because it requires a healthy interior psyche to be able to do the hard work of that inner introspection and to entrust in a loving God as we move through that process of what Keating would call, throwing out the garbage, letting that divine healer, right, take all that junk out of us and sort of heal us in meditation. But it requires us to see it. M. Scott Peck, in his now famous book he wrote, I think in the 80s, called People of the Lie, where he tries to describe a psychological profile of human evil. And what he says is that the sociopath is not evil because they don't have a conscience. That's what makes them sociopathic, right? They have no conscience, so they're unable to empathize with someone else's pain. So they can do all manner of harm to another human being and never feel a twinge of guilt. But he says an evil person is actually somebody who has such a weak psyche that they know that they're doing something wrong. They know that their actions are detrimental, are hurtful to another person, but don't have the inner capacity to interrogate themselves enough to stop it, to recognize that what they're doing is hurting that person and therefore, in a sense, resulting in all of this inner turmoil, but they don't have the strength to see that or to admit it, so they shut down. So he says, basically, you end up with a kind of malignant narcissism, a person who is so narcissistic that they become the victim even when they're the oppressor, and so forth and so on. These are these deep psychological unmet needs by which we can psychologically twist in our minds and just thereby justify the harm we do to another because we're unable to reconcile or to deal with it or address it within ourselves.
Does this also happen on a cultural level?
Oh, I think so. I think, for example, as we struggle with the question of, which is on our, it should be, if it isn't, but on our, the horizon of our minds now more than ever is for us to start to really understand what we call structural racism in this country. Mm-hmm. And I think what D'Angelo talked about in her book on white fragility has a lot to do with that defensive posture of, hey, I'm not a racist. I don't actively or overtly think badly of people of color or actively discriminate. But what the point is that defensiveness is a kind of a denial of trying to also acknowledge that that's not where the problem lay. It's in something much deeper, much structural, and much more ubiquitous, that it's almost impossible for us to disengage or unentangle, because it's by virtue of perception of your skin color that makes all the difference, privileged or not, as is the, so we have to come to understand that our, for example, collective, in this case, white resistance to that is I think a collective example of, oh, what is that defensiveness rising up in me? Why do I feel that? Well, because I don't want to think of myself as having as being privileged in a racist society, and therefore because that makes me feel bad about myself, and it's not what I don't want to think of myself in that way. I don't want to be that kind of person, but I can't disentangle any more than, the way we can't disentangle from the fact of how much capitalism and therefore the purchases we make are built on the backs of the poor throughout the world. And I don't want to think of myself as somebody who exploits other people. But on the other hand, let's look at our closets. Let's look at right? And see how many of those clothing, that shirt, that jacket was sewn in a sweatshop. See, but these are the inconvenient social constructed truths that I almost don't know how to extract myself from. I need a pair of shoes and I'm not sure which one to buy, and right, and so forth and so on. So we are so intertwined and engaged that this is as much a communal and social reflection that has to be happening as much an interior and personal one.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Nora and Kevin, I see your hands up. Can I just ask you to raise your little electronic hand? You do that by going down to participants at the bottom of your screen, and you should then see your name appear in a column to the right. And either at the bottom of that or next to your hand, you should see a little option to raise your hand. And I only ask that because I see a number of folks who have their hands up, and I want to try to take them in order. Are you guys able to see that? I'm going to go ahead and write your names down in the meantime as I move on. And if I don't see your hands go up, I'll know to come back to you right after Kevin. Okay. Oh, there you go. Kevin. Okay, Kevin, I got you there. And Nora, I'll come to you right after that. Okay. Okay. Lots of hands this morning. That's nice. Kathy Todd, please. Oh, we already took you. Okay. Carol, please.
Preach, Father, preach. I'm right on board with the Scott Peck understanding of evil. But anyway, that wasn't my question. But once again, you pulled the rug out from under me. I sent you a private message. I realized in the meditating that I have attributed my true self to being really the good parts of my false self. And that's not really my true self. That's also an image. And so that was another. So then how do we get in touch with our true self? Because I see what Brother Columba is saying. The ego is going to go away. The false self is going to go away. We will truly be naked. But I'd like to know who I am before I die. and to, you know what I mean? And to walk in that a little bit so that I'm familiar with myself when I meet Jesus.
That's exactly right. You know, a friend and I were just talking this week about Thomas Merton's book, New Seeds of Contemplation. And one of the things he talks about is the Christian tradition as being at once traditional and revolutionary. And he basically says everything has been revealed, but that in Christ, but that whole revelation has not yet been fully understood. And so the whole process of understanding that is more than just an intellectual, rational, or academic. It's the stripping down, the becoming naked. It's the recognizing that God is naked before us, before we're naked before God, in a sense, right? That there is, so the whole of the spiritual life is a slowly stripping away of all of those layers of clothing and everything. And all I can say is that I think we know it in glimpses. And potentially, I don't believe that one only comes to the fullness of their identity in death necessarily, but that we do get real glimpses of what that looks like, and that those glimpses can indeed, even if brief moments, can indeed shape the direction of our life. And transform who we are, because suddenly we know, oh, that's not me, that's just a lumpy sweater I keep putting on. And even though I keep in a habit wearing that lumpy sweater, I know there's something more authentic beneath it. And that knowing through that brief glimpse or experience that we might call a mystical experience or an experience of consolation, in a sense can take us much further than we might realize. So I know how you're feeling, but look, I would also argue that even Jesus, even the gospel would tell us that when the moment that Jesus really understood to the fullness his own identity was in the resurrection, and I don't think it was really before then. I think that in a sense he was as surprised as anybody to wake up on Easter morning and be like, wait a minute, I get it now. So in a sense, we have resurrection moments in which we wake up briefly or momentarily, but I think the great awakening is in our journey with Christ. We too will finally Paul's beautiful thing, now I see through a glass darkly, then I shall see face to face, now I am known only in part, then I shall be known fully. So that whole thing, we are on the journey, but I do think we can catch enough glimpse to be able to really say, okay, that is me under there. I'm seeing it now. So I just encourage you to continue that. And I know you're doing a fine job. All right. Christine, I think your hand is up next.
Thank you. I'm recalling a sermon that was given by a rabbi once, and I found it very helpful. Very simple. He said that in reading the book of Genesis and the creation story, that the fact that God clothed Adam and Eve was the moment of the creation of spirit becoming incarnate as an enfleshed person. And so that takes away any moral issues. There's nothing pejorative about that, but it does mean we're exiled. Our spirit is exiled from communion with God in heaven, only in spirit. And we now are exiled to this enfleshed human being with all its vulnerability and having to live in a place that's, well, it's different than being an unfleshed spirit in communion with God. Even though our true self is our essential identity. And if I can try to say what I think you're communicating, I just learned about this progression we make from our true self to our narrative self, to our witnessing self, that then moves into a greater true self, which is no self in one's own consciousness, which I thought was just brilliant. But so it seems to me that the ego is coming out of our true essence and it becomes our narrative self. The difference is that this narrative self recognizes our weaknesses, recognizes our brokenness, and is willing to be vulnerable and face the truth of who we are and all our woundedness. Whereas the false self is the mask we wear in defense. And it means the false self is the manipulative self that tries to say, oh, I'm not really this. This is how I want you to see me. You know, because we're so wounded, we need to wear this mask, hide the vulnerability and the brokenness that we internally really know we are, but we can't face, we don't want to look at that. Because we're so terribly wounded. That's where compassion comes in for this false self. And I was trying to think of an example of someone who was doing incredible evil, thinking they were doing good. And Hitler is not a good example for me because everyone admits how horrendously terrible he was. But if you think of someone like Savonarola during the Inquisition, who felt he was being an instrument of God truly and working against the forces of evil for the sake of Christ. But we see what he did and are horrified.
Sure.
Yeah. So I like the idea of thinking of the ego as a narrative self and willing to admit weaknesses, vulnerability.
You know, Christine, just to kind of tie some of what you're saying to an earlier point about the social constructs is, I think we are beginning a great reckoning in this country about the sort of the narrative self of our nation, which every nation has, right? Every nation has a narrative way in which we talk about our history, and it's very idealized, and everything is, you know, standing on truth and justice and the new world and all of this. But we're seeing that how, you know, the victor is always the one to tell the stories and to sing the hymns and to, so what is that, what's really beneath that narrative, and how do we begin? And it's a very painful process because we all, you know, want to think of our country as one that stands in justice and righteousness because it's a reflection of who we are. And when we have to unpack that and realize, oh, this is much sloppier than we imagined and much more oppressive and dealing with the genocide of the natives. And I mean, all of these questions become really painful because it just shatters the narrative self of the nation, and therefore the national pride, and therefore the sense of identity, and the belief we all want to have that we're a benevolent superpower, and all of these things which are just narratives. So the very thing that we have, that we struggle with in narrating our own self in the world, you know, if Hitler had an opportunity to narrate himself and what he thought of himself, I mean, I think it would be shocking to us to see the way he would narrate his sense of mission and identity in the world. It would be so disturbing to the rest of us, right? And I wonder how the Christian missionaries, right, thought of themselves doing the work of Christ. And and the narration they had around that. And in many ways, the silence of meditation and the silence of contemplative prayer moves us necessarily beneath those narratives and requires us to look at those attachments in ways that I think are disturbing, right? But at the same time, liberating, ultimately. But it takes a certain interior constitution. So thank you, Christine. I appreciate that. Joy, please.
Yes, good morning, Father
Good
and
morning.
y'all. You were talking about how that the false self we have to be careful about the ego being conflagrated with the false self. And
Right.
you were talking about that, and that, and you went on somewhere else in your reading about how we need to have our ego develop in a healthy way. Well, I'd like to ask you, where in the world, in this country or in the world, do we ever get lessons? Who have been our teachers? We all come from this place where the false self and the ego is conflagrated, however you pronounce that word. And who teaches us about developing a healthy ego? I'm going to be 70 in December, and I am just now, and I'm kind of a little bit angry about this, I am just now learning about going inside, sitting in contemplation, and going out from that self of who I am and defining what garments do I want to wear. Not only what ones do I want to wear as, let's say, as a sponsor in AA, from that healthy self of who I am and what you're talking about being a professor, I get to come from this inside love and Christ consciousness and define that for the greater good and not from my ego. Where can we teach people this somewhere before they're 70 years old?
Yeah, Joy, it's a really, really great point. And it really points to the fact that I think in our culture, the answer is that teachers, even communities that would support this, are rare and countercultural. We do not have a culture that sustains, supports, I think one could make the case to some degree without over romanticizing it, that a country like Tibet has a more sustained cultural sense of support. Now, I don't want to make it sound like everybody in Tibet is an advanced contemplative or something like this, but I do think that there is a cultural propensity toward a connection around that. Frankly, this is, I think, one of the deficits of a materialistic capitalistic society, where the value of what you're talking about, either in creating, supporting, sustaining teachers, establishing communities by which we can really, is the exception to the rule, and one has to really seek it out. I hope that's the type of thing we're trying to do here together and support one another in, but let's face it, and there are teachers. I mean, I do think, when somebody like Father Thomas Keating, for example, from 40 years of his life or more, really dedicated his whole mission to this very thing, and there's many others, but to really grapple with the fact that our society simply does not, offer a kind of construct, and that there isn't like a spiritual director around every corner of somebody who's walked the path and can really help guide the rest of us, which is why I think communal practice is becoming so much more important, because we don't have a society or even a church that's creating spiritual leaders as much as just overseers, right? People who oversee churches, who oversee dioceses, and so on. But the whole training that priests even go through in most denominations is not about deep spiritual formation. It isn't. It's cursory theology, pastoral theology, how to say mass, those types of things, all important, but not sufficient. Richard Rohr says, you know, contemplation is for the second half of life. I disagree with that insofar as if we don't foster it when people are young, if we don't have a cultural context, then well, what do we expect? Of course it's for the second half of life, because that's the point when we start to say, here I am 50, 60 years old, and what do I have for it? I want to look deeper. But how can we foster that very trajectory at an early age, like the Dalai Lama from 2 years old, right?
Yes.
Not that we should be taking people from their homes and, you know, children from their homes and raising them to be contemplative leaders. But I mean, there's a cultural context there in which we see the value of somebody who's groomed from a very early age to become a great spiritual leader in the world. So it is definitely a problem, but I'm glad you're here among us, because I hope this is one of the avenues where we can address it. Thank you. Wanda, I think your hand was next. Hi.
Good morning, Father. Regarding the concept or the idea of the ego being something we can put on or take off, would that explain why we present ourselves to certain people in certain ways and to other people in other ways? And so both groups of people can see or view that individual very differently because of that. I'm not confused, but let's say Anderson. Anderson presents to group A in a certain way. Anderson presents to group B in a certain way. Both groups see Anderson very differently because of Anderson's, how he wears his ego, how Anderson puts his ego on, takes it off. Is that what you mean, that you can put the ego on and wear it? You wear it differently with different people for different reasons?
Yes, definitely. That is one. I mean, just the way we have multiple outfits in our closet. You know, one is formal, one is casual, one is workout clothing, one is I'm going to a ball. These are ways in which we present ourselves. Now, Wanda, one could say that there is some value in, for example, me presenting what I might think of as a professional self to my students at USF, and that there would be certain inappropriate ways, maybe too casual, maybe there's things that would be inappropriate to share with them, not because they're bad, but because they're just not professional or not part of that milieu where, you know, things about my private life or struggles I have wouldn't be appropriate. So the short answer is absolutely, we present differently to different people and groups. Sometimes that's appropriate because of, say, an act of professionalism. And I think sometimes it's a function of survival as we perceive it, right? I have to present myself differently because this group will not accept X, Y, or Z. And so I put on a mask that really hides my true identity rather than reveal something about it, because I don't feel safe in this particular context of being that vulnerable with X, Y, or Z group. So one could come up with a number of ways in which we can and do present ourselves to the world. Some of those differences or egoic identities we shed, put on or take off, are appropriate. Others, I think, are required of us, or at least perceived so, because of oppressive structures in society or fear I have around a certain group or whatever. And other times, I think in our most intimate circles, there is less of a need for any kind of presentation, right, of self. And this is where we find ourselves most free, because these are the people we would call our closest friends, for example, and we can feel the relaxation of how I can put down all of those things in order to just be free with this individual.
Okay, thank you.
So, yeah, you're very welcome. Kevin.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome.
So I am aware of I have an architecture question for you.
Sure.
So I am aware of personas that I put on that are constructed by the ego to help me get through various life situations. What is it, from whence does the moment by moment sense of consciousness arise? The consciousness which then decides that I need to be shaped in this particular form, in this moment, to respond to the person or situation directly in front of me. And how does that, and I am also aware that when I'm quiet enough, that I can observe this blossoming moment by moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, what is that blossoming sense of self? Where does it come from, moment by moment?
Mm-hmm. It would be talked about, I think, in various ways. Martin Laird talks about becoming aware of the awaring self. And he raises, in a sense, that very question of what is the awaring self once you become aware. It's not just about being aware, it's about being aware that you're aware. Right? It's that step back, which is, I think, where you're kind of asking, where does that awaring self arise from? That's the great mystery on some level. Is that merely the activity or function of the brain? So brainwave activity that we would call maybe the mind. Some people define the mind as the activity of the brain. So the question you're asking is, from whence arises consciousness? And there's multiple ways in which that's explored. Some would argue that consciousness indeed arises out of the activity of the brain. We call that mind, we call that consciousness. Others are suggesting that there is no scientific or physical requirement, or therefore proof, to make that assumption, even though it's the operating assumption within the scientific world. What's being challenged now is a different model, which would say not so much that consciousness arises out of a material mind, but that the material mind becomes the conduit of consciousness that pre-exists it. The way a radio draws from the radio waves that are already in the air and creates, through the mechanism of the radio, takes what is otherwise invisible and unrecognizable or unnoticeable to us and transmits that into voice, into sound, into something, right, that we can identify and relate to. So is consciousness something that arises, and therefore, so the question in center is which comes first, materialism or conscious? By materialism, I don't mean capitalism materialism, I mean the materialism of the universe, right? Physicality. So what comes first, physicality or consciousness? If it's physicality, then indeed what you're asking is, out of activity of the brain through self-awareness and the awaring self arises these thoughts, filtered through one's experience of woundedness, who I can trust, who's safe, who's not, where I have to be professional, all those unspoken social ideas about how I'm supposed to conduct myself. All of that gets filtered in a very complex way, and in a moment you know how to respond. In this context, I have to be professional. I'm before, a dignitary, or this is just my kid and I can be casual. All of that, I think, happens almost at this point in a complex, almost instantaneous way, because we've learned it. Or the other model, consciousness precedes materiality. So, right, before there is a big bang, before there is a creation, there is divine consciousness. There is consciousness, in some ways, is God. And then that consciousness gets filtered. The brain is evolved as the perfect or near perfect instrument that has the capacity to relay that consciousness which precedes it and transcends it. This is the big philosophical question.
Thank you very much.
Does that help you think through it a little, Kevin?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nora, please.
Well, I'm wondering if you speak of ego as like a healthy piece of clothing, and I'm wondering, following Kevin's question, whether we develop when we develop a consciousness of when we are acting out of the false self, that's our healthy construct of ego. Is that what you're saying? That when we and even if this consciousness pre-exists, whether we know that or not, but when we are conscious that we are acting out of the false self, when we can observe that in ourselves, is that then when the ego is that healthy piece of clothing? And then secondly, does that consciousness, our conscience of the consciousness that may pre-exist, is that our union with God? Is that what we call unity? And the false self then alienates us from that unity, and therefore that consciousness.
So I want to I'll bring first of all to your first half of the question just some clarity. So if you think of the ego as a tool that we can take up or put down, or as a piece of clothing we can put on or take off, I think that is moving in the direction of a healthy egoic relationship, because you're not over-identifying with it. You don't see it as yourself. You recognize its functionality in the world, and yet you don't over-identify. You don't mistake your identity for that thing. It would be like a carpenter suddenly believing he was a hammer. That would be ridiculous. The hammer is just a tool that he uses to construct a house. So a healthy ego is not one that is under the influence or control of the false self. That's what I would call the over-identification with ego. Because the false self, Merton clarified this for me in one of his books I read years ago. I can't remember where I saw it, but I think it could have been New Seeds of Contemplation, actually, where he says the false self isn't false because there's something there that's not true. He said the false self is false because it's not there at all. It's a deficit. It's an illusion. We think it's there. That's why we call it the false self. So it's a self that God doesn't recognize because there's nothing there. We think it is, but God can't affirm it, can't recognize it, doesn't see it, doesn't know it, because it in fact isn't there. It's not actually in existence. What we tend to do if we are living out of that illusion of a false self is we need something to fill it. It's almost like the way we would need to wrap bandages around an invisible person in order to see something that is otherwise not visible. So we wrap it so that, oh, now I can see the form it's taking. Well, when we live out of this thing, we spin out of injury and out of the sense of existential angst or the interior abyss or emptiness, when we face that inner void and it terrifies us, or when we're wounded by unmet needs and emotional crises that we have as in our formative years, we don't have the psychological ability to separate our ego from those unmet needs. And so we use the ego to fill those needs. We use the ego to soothe them, to protect them, to build a fortress around them, right? Because I'm hurt, I can't deal with somebody betraying me. I can't deal with abandonment. I can't deal with the way somebody might hurt me again, the way somebody did when I was younger, etc. So I seek power, because I know when I have power, I feel in control. And when I feel in control, I feel less vulnerable. And when I feel less vulnerable, then I'm happier, or think I'm happier. So I seek positions of power in the world. I become a police officer. I become a military person. I become a professor. I become a doctor, a lawyer, somebody who has power in society, because knowing that I have power is going to give me control. What really needs to happen is for me to understand that these needs need to be healed, need to be addressed, need to be looked at. And I need to do that before a loving God, before a loving community, with deep introspection. Once I'm able to see, oh, there's something deeper here than those unmet needs, those psychological wounds, etc., I can let go of ego and realize, oh, I don't need the ego to replace or to fill in or to protect those wounds, because I'm now moving to heal them. A posture of vulnerability now allows me to let go of all those things that the egoic identity was supposed to achieve for me. Then the ego can now start to act under the influence of the true self, which is not to say my spirit as such, but everything about me, my whole self, body, mind, spirit, my psychology, my emotions. That's the true self, the whole kit and caboodle, as it were. Now, in a sense, what we have is an egoic identity that is healthy, because like Laird, I become aware of the awareing self. I can step back, see how my ego identity is functioning in the world, and rather than over-identify it or think that it's actually me, I can say, oh, well, now that position of power can actually be used not as a self-defensive protective mechanism in which I make myself feel secure in the world, but one in which I use that to help other people feel protected, other people feel secure, other people feel heard. And at the end of the day, I can put those tools down. I don't have to live constantly out of that posture. So the healthy ego is not one under the control of the false self. That's an unhealthy ego. The ego is being used to replace my sense of identity, and I over-identify. It's when the ego is recognized as something that isn't me, but is a part of my constructed identity in the world, I can now use that hammer, wear that uniform as needed, and put it down when it's not needed, because I know there's something real.
The posture of vulnerability is the true self. I really, that speaks to me. And I guess I want to say that as a person of faith, I don't think I can do that task alone. I just...
No, that's right. And that's why, Nora, there's really no such thing as a private Christianity, right? The whole notion is that we are, even in our solitude, are never isolated, that there is a degree which all of this has to unfold, not just on some cave up in a mountain, but in relationship with people, right? What does it mean to be vulnerable if we're not being vulnerable with other people? If we don't learn to build vulnerable communities for one another.
And also before God.
Of course, yeah. So our moment of our the time we move into our meditation and prayer life, in which we share that intimacy with God, extends to the whole community. And when we get to chapter 4, probably 3 years from now at the pace we're going, when we get to chapter 4, we'll see that asceticism is precisely that. It's taking that interior movement toward divine human vulnerability and extending that to communal vulnerability. What it means for me to love people in a vulnerable way.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really helpful.
Okay, thanks, Nora.
Vulnerability. It's just a very good phrase. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you guys find it helpful, because I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but I'm just trying to wing it. So no, kidding, Nora. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Mary, I think your hand was next.
Thank you. I know I spoke before. Thank you for having another turn. I'm reading Jesus and the Disinherited, and you're speaking about structural racism in relationship to this topic. Mm-hmm. He speaks about the people at the wall, mm-hmm. the homeless, the poor, the minority people, the marginalized people that need to have almost psychic surgery to make a space for there to be any room for their presence, for a platform for their presence. And I've been staying with that all week, and it came up last night, like how I can't get the idea that contemplation is somehow a privilege, that everything you spoke about this morning, I wonder, the people that he speaks about, how do they have the time? How do they have the place? And how do they have the room inside themselves to do this process? And it makes it, as I'm thinking about asking you this question, I just got very sad. It made me very sad.
Mm-hmm. I know. No, you're pointing to a real thing, and one of the ways in which this plays out in a tragic sense, and in a way that we have to really attend to, is something that has been recently, more on the horizon, but a long time phenomena that's known as code switching, which is it's a way in which we have to present ourselves in a way that's acceptable to the dominant group, right? So code switching is, I talk one way or act one way when among my group or clan or, tribe or family or whatever that is, like those with whom I'm comfortable, depending on how you're creating the divisions. But then I know that when I'm in the world, I have to present myself very differently. Now that's a very, talk about the psychic, need to constantly determine, is it safe to really be who I am right now? Or do I have to talk or act in a certain way that's going to make me professional, that's going to make me acceptable, that's going to make me somebody who the larger dominant culture is going to be okay with? And this is, of course, it's profoundly toxic to groups that are oppressed. I mean, even within the gay community for years and years and years, it's about, can you pass? Right? You see that. Can you pass? So even within subcultures, you have oppression happening within those cultures, right? Gay men making fun of effeminate men, right? So forth, because that's seen as not passable. So that becomes even within the community, an object of ridicule, for example, right? Or when you have in communities of color where subtly or not so subtly, lighter skin is somehow held on a higher level than darker skin. And you're talking about people within, right, sort of non-white communities. You realize the internalization of oppressive narratives when you hear and see communities within themselves drawing on those same levels of oppression that is actually imposed by the dominant culture. This is profoundly toxic, because even then within communities where one would assume there is safety to do the kind of exploration you're talking about, there's still hierarchies, all trying to make themselves acceptable to the dominant class. And that needs to be, this is why, for example, we're seeing now, to look at, your reading of Thurman, which is a beautiful book, by the way. I'm glad you're reading this. This is, when we look at this type of issue, it's why allies are so important. Why discipleship today has to be, Christian discipleship cannot ignore the question of sustained racism in this country and think of themselves as disciples. This is one of the major things of our day that we have to look at in terms of what discipleship means, right? So, I share your sadness in this, Mary, but I'm hoping that there's been a shift or an expansion of consciousness that will be sustained and isn't going to just show up as a blip in our history, but that people really understand the role and the need for allyship, because that's the safety becomes more. The safety isn't just safety that I feel within people of my own sort of racial or ethnic background, but understand that people well beyond those borders are with me.
So, how do you connect that to contemplative communities, where contemplative communities are predominantly white? I think they are. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me like they're predominantly white.
You know what? I think what it is that what contemplative means has been defined predominantly by white people. But I think Richard Rohr and the Living School is really taking a look at how has the notion of what makes a contemplative actually, been dominant, the definition of that been dominated by, if you want to say, Western European history, predominantly white, right? And therefore is now adopted in the United States and other countries, out of a kind of European and therefore largely white experience. But his point is, and he's, having a lot of speakers beginning to explore the question, maybe what we think of as contemplation is in fact happening in all different ways that we just are only now beginning to recognize, right? And that the very specific way, even that we're kind of modeled on here, this sort of sitting in silence together, is one particular way, but we maybe have to broaden our lens and say, oh, contemplative practice is alive and well in other cultures. We just don't see it because we're not recognizing that it's taken root and expressed itself in different ways.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. Okay, and that brings us to Joanne, please. Joanne, are you there? I'm not sure. I don't. I'm sorry, Joan, did you want to? Was it Joanne or Joan? I actually put the hand down and I can't remember if I saw Joanne or Joan. Joan, is that you? That you had your hand up, Ms. Stretta? Joan? Okay, just want to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
There you go.
Yeah, I did have my hand up.
Okay, sorry for the confusion.
Call
Okay.
on me. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick. The basic thing that I'm going to ask here is, are these two things connected? The one thing that's going on right here today with me, and this other thought I had, is I'm trying to hurry up and learn these things for the exact reason that's been mentioned by a couple of people here. And I'm doing it at age 85 and a half. I've started to count my age in months the way they do when you're a baby, or people do when you're a baby. So when someone tells me they're doing it at 70, I think, oh, lucky you.
Young, yeah, spring chicken.
But anyway, I'm trying to put these things together. And I had this thought a while back. It was kind of like a bam, thought in my head. And and I'm asking whether that's part of what we're talking about with the ego and so on, culturally and individually. It's when you make an idol out of something. That's always, always, always a bad thing to do. And this is my idea. And and I'm talking about consumerism, and which I've suddenly begun to recognize as this really thing with a lot of evil aspects to it that I never thought about before. And it suddenly came to me, in this country, we don't have capitalism as an economic system. We have it as a religion. And it's because as an economic system, it could be fine. I mean, it's all right. There are others, different ones too, but that it's not bad in and of itself, as we're talking about a tool, a hammer, and stuff like that. But we have made a religion of it, I think, and because and an example of that is anything that cuts down on a profit, an economic profit, is really seen as a bad thing. That is the first thing that we have to make sure happens, is that the economic profit. So does that make sense? Do those two things, what we're learning today, or talking about today, and that idea, does that make sense?
It does, and I agree with you. Having lived in Belgium, which was a lovely country, socialized, by and large, where there were a lot of restrictions. It was very impossible to, for example, make the caps on the types of income someone could have are limited by a lot of economic constructs. And while that on some level had certain social benefits to it, it also, I noticed, a lack of entrepreneurship, a lack of creativity, a lack of motivation to try to strive for new inventions and this and that, because there was no monetary benefit. So be that good or ill, capitalism does have its benefits to some degree, but you're absolutely right that once you make money and profit, the religion, the God of the land, then absolutely it becomes, and it has, I think, clearly in the United States, and what many have called unbridled capitalism. Pope Francis is clear about this in his Laudato Si, his whole treatise, his encyclical on the environment, where he really links the problems of the market economy and all of the pressures in a capitalist system, which is literally destroying the planet, because all that it cares about is right now the profit, the bottom line, right? The dollar, and how that has to be mitigated in some way by justice and all the things that, the gospel would call us to. So yeah, there's absolutely a connection. And I think it's part of the reason why this culture is not interested in cultivating the contemplative life. It's far more interested in diverting us from thinking about it, distracting us, new gadgets, right? Anything that will take us away from having to imagine or think about that we're going to die and so forth. All of these things are simply postponed for the current moment, for the pleasure it can provide. It's very dangerous. Thank you. And finally, you're very welcome. Finally, Ruth, and then we'll move on to our practice for today. Ruth, please.
First, thanks for going slowly. You're introducing so much valuable vocabulary that enables me to talk with others about all of this growth. My question goes back to some of the things that you discussed earlier and from your book. You say we project our sense of self into the world, thriving on competition, exerting our control, manipulating relationships to avoid further pain, and assert our own dominance. My question is related to the contemplative sit, because when I look at that sentence, if somebody asked me to describe myself honestly and with insight, that sentence would have to be a part of that description. So when I'm doing my contemplative sit, where I go with all sincerity, with the intent of letting go of some of those bandages that I used to cover the false self, and letting go also of some of the layers of that borrowed clothing, to sit openly and vulnerably in the presence of a loving God. Am I, in doing that, also practicing that movement for the external world, practicing opening up to that vulnerability here with friends, in church community, and those things? That's the question.
Yeah, and I can only affirm absolutely, right, that it's why we cannot take for granted wherever there is authentic community, wherever there is, real intimacy among people. The only place we can do this work is in ourselves and in our local, in where we are. We have to function out of the context in which we're in. And that we never should underestimate the value and the importance of that small piece. One of the things that I'll look at later in the book is trying to help us avoid two polar opposites. One is being paralyzed by so much craziness, right? All the things we're confronted with in the world right now can be paralyzing, or it can be absolutely defeating because I'm just overwhelmed. People call it compassion fatigue, right? Whatever you want to call it, that we just feel like there's nothing I can do. The problems are too big, so I'm just going to go into a cocoon. The other end of that spectrum is I can or should do it all, that somehow I am responsible for fixing the world's problems. The problem with both of those is that neither of them are accurate in terms of our capacity of being in relationship with the world around us. We can't do it all. We shouldn't be expected to do it all. None of us can do it all. And in a sense, you're moving into an almost egotistical narcissism to lay that burden on your shoulder. It is a subtle form of narcissism that I have to be the planetary savior. Rather, think of ourselves as an eye, an ear, a nose, a hand, a foot on the body of Christ, right? In which I have to do my part to see, to embrace, to walk, to hear, to speak, whatever my gifts are, and contribute to that larger movement. Never, never, never should be underestimated. That's the only thing we can do. It's the only thing any of us can do, is our little part. And the connection between that thing that I do in my heart, that movement, that disentangling, that becoming aware of the awareing self, that recognizing in myself that one line that you say has to be included, is where the rubber meets the road, because it is what enables me not to continue to be part of the problem, but to become part of the solution, as the current saying goes, right? I have to be able to look inside myself with all honesty and see those things so that I can say, that's not me. And there is grace operative that transcends that in me. Does that help you?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, very good. Okay, let me take you guys back to the screen share then. I know we've gone, I can't believe it's 8:44, I'm so sorry. Here's our practice for this week. I want you to rummage through your bedroom closet, and I want you to find a shirt or a pair of pants, a sweater or jacket you've not worn in ages, and yet which you still have not given away. And I know you all know the piece of clothing I'm talking about. So as you sit in meditation this week, just simply lay it beside you. That's all you have to do. I just want you to have that with you in your meditation as a little sacramental, as a little token. And I want you to explore the sensation of attachment that you feel to it. Don't judge it. Just notice what comes up. Why is it that every time you rummage through the closet, you say, I haven't worn this in 2 years, but I'm not ready to let it go? What is that about? Just explore the nature of that attachment and then ask what it reveals about you. What stories, memories, explanations, or sensations rise up? Oh, that sweater was given to me by such and such a person. Oh, I wore that on this special occasion, or whatever the case may be. And what does this teach you about your own attachment to ego? Remember, we're looking here at the question of borrowed clothing, right? So what does your attachment to that lumpy sweater, right, that jacket, that pair of pants, what does that teach you about the way in which you experience those same types of attachments to the immaterial things, right, the interior? And then when you're ready, let it go so that someone else who is naked may be clothed with it. I think sometimes by exteriorizing our practice in some symbolic form and identifying the types of things that arise in that material association, we can come to a deeper awareness. That lumpy sweater is your teacher this week. What does it have to teach you about yourself? What does it have to teach you about the way in which you experience attachment? What stories do you associate that cultivate that attachment? And then when you're ready, see if you can let it go. Any questions about that? Gerald, please. Gerald, I'm not sure if I see.
Father Pizzuto.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead, Gerald. Okay, I think he might be having a connectivity problem.
Yeah, I'm having some internet difficulty getting in and out. I noticed this week that you are Professor Pizzuto versus Father Pizzuto, you usually are. Are you telling us something, or?
That's just another piece of clothing I wear. Now that classes are in session, I keep forgetting I have to change my name depending on whether I'm teaching my students or on this. And I don't know how Zoom figures out, because I don't even use this one to teach my classes, but somehow it remembers that. So what you're seeing is that there's my own confusion around what article of clothing I should be wearing right now, my professor cap or my cassock. But I just didn't even notice that's just because I'm in the middle of a semester which started last week.
Well, when you teach us, should you change it to Grand Master?
Yeah, I could try something fun like that, but that wouldn't be good for my ego identity. So thank you, Gerald, for noticing that. I'll go ahead and change that. I'll try to remember next time. Yeah.
No, I'm fine.
There we go. There you go. So okay, Joy, you had a question.
Quick question. Yes. My question is, I have things in my closet that belongs to my daughter, that I don't wear very often. Are you talking about things like that also, or just things that I have purchased for myself, or things that I've accumulated over the years that belong to other people who have passed? Do we do that same exercise?
That's a great question. I think in some ways, ultimately we do, but I would caution just a tremendous amount of sensitivity around how you would, approach those things that belong to your daughter, because I know that those will have deep, deep meaning, not just because they're things you don't wear, but because of the connection it brings to you.
Okay.
That said, in the broadest spectrum, and this is not something that I'm trying to suggest you do unless and until you're ready, it still does on some level represent an attachment to what was, rather than a receiving of what is, right? In my father's passing last November, one of the things I struggled with is that beautiful idea that because even though I don't see you anywhere, I see you everywhere, and trying to move from the mourning process has been a lot about letting go of the way in which I was able to relate to my father as a being, as a person, right? Right, somebody who takes up space, and having to let go of that to see how he might continue to be present to me well beyond those forms and ways. But that said, all of his clothing are still in his closet because my mother isn't ready to let that go. And I fully understand that and would never press her on that point, even though she's obviously not wearing his clothing, right? So, but is there a degree in which our grief for our loved ones, part of moving through that is also a process of letting go of what was, that we can open ultimately to what is, and the way in which that your daughter, my father, continues to be present in ways that don't require clothing, right? But has something to do with being present to Christ, who is everywhere, and therefore there is even Christ, right? When in that beautiful dialogue with Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel, when she sees him come from the tomb and grabs at his feet, and he says, "Don't cling to me, I have to go to the Father." Or he's saying, "Don't cling to this old form, I need to be present in a way that goes far beyond the limitations of my earthly life, something much deeper, richer, truer." And I think that is the process of grieving that we all have to come to, letting go of old forms in order to receive what is now. So for this exercise, I would say work with your own clothing.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want to burden you too much. And if and when you feel ready to explore that with your daughter's clothing, then I leave that to your discretion. Okay. All righty. So I noticed, by the way, a ton of messages coming in. I have to confess, as I'm talking, I haven't been able to read them. So I will try to, Roger, if it's possible to grab hold of those and send those to me, I'll have a look and see if there's anything that I might be able to comment on afterward. So thank you all for a very rich, thank you. Yeah, thank you for all of your, let me try to see where I can hear myself talking about it. Yeah, I want to just thank you all for all of the rich and varied questions today. It's, some good thought processes going on and some good searching, good soul searching. So thank you all. It's a really delight to be with you. So I look forward then to seeing you all again next week, and I bid you Benum Christ in it. And